Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Amanda McKendree, and I serve as the Arthur F. and Mary J. O'Neill Director of the Fanning Center for Business Communication in the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. I'll be serving as today's moderator with you all. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion in our series, Communicating with Impact. We'll spend the next few weeks exploring the area of civil discourse, becoming a better conversation partner. Our hope is that this series content will create opportunities for us to connect with one another and build a virtual community with a global reach. We've seen a very strong interest in this topic so far, with over 874 participants registered for this learning community. Today's format, featuring a high-impact panel, will include opportunities for interaction and engagement. You will be asked to pose questions during our time together. I'll now share a little bit about that process. When you have a question, please use the Google form that we are sharing with you now. This will allow us to facilitate the questions as effectively as possible. Our Zoom host, as you can see, has placed that link in the chat for you. At this time, I would also like to thank our co-sponsors for our series, the Mendoza College of Business and the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Several individuals from various communications teams to the ThinkND production team contributed the necessary time and expertise to make this session possible. Now I'd like to welcome today's guests who are with us to reflect on this question of what is the role of business to reduce polarization in our society. They'll also offer some insights along the way on how to promote civil discourse and help us find common ground. Bob Feldman is the founder of the Dialogue Project, a global initiative to explore what role business can play to reduce polarization and improve civil discourse in our society. The program is now housed at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. Kristen Hansen is co-founder of the Civic Health Project, an initiative dedicated to reducing toxic partisan polarization and enabling healthier public discourse and decision-making across our citizenry, politics, and media. Kristen also lectures at Stanford University. Stacy Sharp is Senior Vice President of Corporate Relations at Allstate. She is the leader of Allstate's involvement with the Aspen Institute on the Better Arguments Project, a remarkable award-winning program. Welcome, Bob, Kristen, and Stacy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This call for civil discourse is not new. We've been struggling to embrace the concepts, enact civil discourse in public and private settings. However, our panelists today have met these challenges and identified ways to be successful in their efforts. Bob, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about the Dialogue Project and your motivation for creating this initiative?
Yeah, happy to, Amanda. Thank you, and thanks for having me and for having this tremendous series. I think it's so important. The impetus for this was some work I was doing with the Page Society, which is the Industry Association for Chief Communications Officers and agency leaders and so forth. And we were talking, and I was giving a speech and talking about polarization and discourse because I thought it was so important. But really with a particular view of what role business should play. And there were some drivers that kind of made that an important area of focus. One is, if you think about it, when you're in the work environment, it's one of the very, very few places where you're actually often surrounded by people who have differing perspectives. They come from maybe different geographies, different ethnic backgrounds, all sorts of different backgrounds. Diversity, hopefully with great diversity in every sense of that word. That doesn't happen very often for most of us in most other places. We tend to, unfortunately, kind of live in bubbles. And so the workplace serves as a unique environment and almost potential laboratory, if you will, to actually do something about this. So that's kind of one observation. The other is many of the folks in the audience may be familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer. They came out with this year's report that basically revealed that that business is the most trusted institution, over or more so than the other institutions they studied, which included government and media and NGOs. Now, I think the research would suggest it's not that business is doing so great. It's a little bit like it's last man standing. I mean, trust in media, trust in government, trust, a little surprisingly, but even in NGOs has subsided. But I think that creates enormous, I don't know, it's either an opportunity or responsibility. I think it's a responsibility for business to do something. This issue of polarization, the challenges of discourse have only gotten worse. I mean, when we started this, it was a while ago. It's only gotten worse. There's no end in sight. If you're like me, you could pick up the paper every day and there are stories. I don't know if you read, just for example, actually it wasn't yesterday, I think the day before, Tom Friedman in the New York Times wrote a piece. It kind of angled it around the Middle East. I mean, the headline was, have we reshaped Middle East politics, or are we starting to mimic it? And he said, Middle Easterners may call their big tribes Shiites and Sunnis, and Americans may call theirs Democrats and Republicans, but they each seem to operate increasingly with this conformist us versus them mindset. And that ultimately we need to find the antidote to this tribalism fast. Otherwise, the future is grim for democracies everywhere. I mean, you're reading stuff like that all the time. And so it just kind of begs the question, all right, well, what shouldn't business play a role, and what should business do? I could go on, but why don't I kind of pause, because you may have more questions or want to go in a different way. But that's kind of the backdrop to say, okay, what's the role of business here to play a part in solving a problem that I think we all agree is a huge problem?
Bob, you've certainly got us thinking too about healthy democracies, and you've provided actually a very nice segue there to Kristen's work. And Kristen, can we turn to you now and share a little bit about your role with the Civil Health Project?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I run a nonprofit called Civic Health Project, and we're engaged broadly in determining how best to address these deep divides in our country, which can be characterized as political, ideological, sometimes faith-based, sometimes race-based, but we've reached a boiling point in the country. And so it does beg the question, what is the role of business here? And it's certainly understandable to hold a perspective that places of work should be kind of barricaded off from these conflicts, a safe zone, if you will, where people can just go put their heads down and get their work done. The reality, unfortunately, is a little bit more complicated than that. And it's why I'd like to just enter into this panel discussion, teeing up the themes of risk and opportunity. So businesses are accustomed to looking at and calculating things in terms of risk. And what I think all of us on the panel would like to offer up is that understanding and looking under the hood in this area of viewpoint diversity, of the fact that within our workplaces, people as individuals hold a diversity of opinions and perspectives. And sometimes those get expressed in the workplace setting, and sometimes they get expressed outside the workplace, but seep into the walls of work. And there are many, many risks attendant with that businesses are grappling with right now. And we see it, and more of these conversations are happening all the time. And risks when you have conflicting perspectives within the workplace can include such things as people feeling that they're working in a hostile work environment. Productivity can suffer. Cooperation and collaboration can break down. And people can feel so uncomfortable in a certain work setting that it can drive up attrition. You also have to think about the impact of conflict outside the walls of the workplace and how division starts to manifest within your customer base, for example. And how does the position that a company takes or the attributes of a company land on customers that are also people out in the world. So this is all on the risk side. But there's also a tremendous opportunity. And I want to loop back to what Bob said about the high level of trust and engagement that people have with their employers. Workplaces are where people tend to bring their best selves. Workplaces are also formative in the sense that as individuals, we cultivate many, many skills, as well as social relationships through our work. And workplaces tend to be one of the more cross-cutting environments in which we find ourselves, where we can engage and interact with people who are different from us. It's happening less and less in our neighborhoods, in our churches, in our schools. But when we go to work, not for everyone, but for many of us, work is where we encounter people who come from different perspectives. So that's a tremendous opportunity. And I think that increasingly, many of us who work on bridging divisions in our country, are looking to companies, calling on companies to say, please help, because you have an environment in which people can develop skills that are going to be important for fostering new norms, civil discourse norms, open-minded norms, intellectual humility norms in our country. You don't have to say, hey, in our workplace, we're just going to have a big debate about pro-choice versus pro-life, or who should be president of our country. That's not what we mean. It means creating time and space for individuals to reflect on what it means to carry with us norms that will enable us to engage with one another in healthier, more constructive ways through these principles of civil discourse, listening, perspective giving and taking, open-mindedness, empathy, and so on. Really, we think that businesses and workplaces are where these skills can flourish.
So, Kristen, you've named a number of very practical applications and practices that we can all use every day in our professional, personal lives. And this is where Stacy's viewpoint is so important as well. Her work has identified some very concrete, actionable steps that are meant to help our communities and certainly our participants on the call with us today. Stacy, can you talk a little bit about your work with the Better Arguments Project?
Absolutely. And just to echo Bob and Kristen's point about the role that business has specifically, many corporations and Allstate definitely feels that we have to operate as part of society, not apart from society. And we're often talking about inclusion and helping our employees bring their full selves to work. Well, if you truly want to have authentic leaders inside your company, you have to give them the space to be all they are within their work. And I want to go back to kind of the origin story of Better Arguments, because it could also help everyone in the audience understand that we all have a role in change, no matter what seat we sit in and what organization we may be a part of. So I'll take you back to November 1st, 2016. We can all probably remember what we felt like during those times. It was a time of great tension, obviously a time of deepening divides in our country. And there was a lot of questions about what next. No matter who won that election, where would we go from there? And on that day, on November 1st, 2016, I was reading an opinion piece in The Atlantic by Eric Liu, who Allstate has done some work with. And it was called "Americans Don't Need Reconciliation. They Need to Get Better at Arguing." And it piqued my interest. Again, as a leader of a major corporation, it's like, how are we going to be part of this solution? It's like, okay, what is more arguing? How is that going to help this situation? And he referenced the fact that we often are moving to, we're all in this together. We've got to get to reconciliation without having a true reckoning of why people feel the way they feel about a particular issue. And he mentioned in that article an organization, Facing History and Ourselves, who is all about truly understanding historical context, understanding your personal identity in order to be an upstander in society. And I was very passionate about what he wrote, know Eric well. So I sent an email to my friends at Facing History and Ourselves, who Allstate also supports. And I said, I read this article from Eric Liu. We should think about how we can go from this visionary idea of reckoning within our country to pragmatic solutions on how to help people get there. And they knew Eric well, and so we're already talking to him. So let's get together and see what we can do. And that was the germ of an idea about Better Arguments. And we even had some good arguments about what to call it. But it is truly about arguing. It's not about papering over our differences. It's being empathetic, yes, but it's about getting to the root cause of why we believe what we believe and learning from one another. So from 2017 to 2019, we went to advisors, we traveled the country. We tested topics from Alaska to Detroit to Colorado. We talked to youth groups, all different community leaders across our country to come up with what we thought would be strong dimensions and principles to help people engage across differences. And so I'll go through those quickly, and then we can have a conversation about that and get into more detail of any of them. First, the dimensions are important. Before you even get into a conversation or decide what topics to discuss, you've got to think about the historical context. Often in business, we say crises have deep roots. Well, guess what? Our beliefs as individuals have deep roots. And a lot of times you're coming to these arguments or tough conversations with what you think today, but not really realizing how deep they're rooted based on your values, based on your upbringing, based on your family context. So really understanding historical context before you even get into the conversation. The other is, which we talk about in business a lot, emotional intelligence. Bringing that level of empathy to the conversation, understanding that you're seeking to understand, not just to be understood, and really understanding that these arguments are wrought with emotion. So how are you going to not lead with that, but really lead with empathy and learning? The final dimension is to recognize power. Got a question a lot about why would Allstate get this deep in this topic? Well, we actually have a behavior. We have 4 key behaviors that we're trying to drive as an organization. And one of them is challenge ideas. And regardless of hierarchy, and that's tough to do. So in Better Arguments, we're trying to help people understand, be honest about the power dynamics in a conversation so that people understand where they are coming from and their voices can be heard no matter who has perceived power in that conversation. So thinking about those dimensions first. And then we get into 5 principles, which I'll go through quickly. The first is take winning off the table. And I got to tell you, based on our experiences, that's the toughest one, because we do have deeply held beliefs. And a lot of times, especially in our country today, people are in their neutral corners and they're very much focused on trying to advance their point of view. So the first thing about this is decentering yourself, take winning off the table, is critical to having a true productive argument. The second is to prioritize relationships and listen passionately. This is one that I can speak to personally that's been the most helpful, because many of these issues are emotionally charged and difficult. And especially if you're talking to people that have deeply opposing points of view, if you prioritize the relationship, that after this tough conversation, this emotionally charged conversation, I still want to make sure this person wants to engage in conversation with me again, it changes the entire dynamics of the conversation. Third, pay attention to context. So I talked about historical context, but whether it was the youth, our advisors, or when we went to communities, the space that you have the conversation, where people, what they're bringing into the conversation, why they have these beliefs, and trying to understand that before you're even looking at the surface facts of an argument is critically important. Fourth, also difficult but necessary, embrace vulnerability. If you're not ready to recognize that you have doubts, that you are willing to hear a different point of view, and truly, and it's the last principle, which is make room to transform. Those two go together, embracing vulnerability and making room to transform. Otherwise, what's the point of the conversation, right? Where you have to not be in it to convince the other person of your point of view, but really be opening to have a different point of view, or at least learning something different about a topic that you didn't know before when you got into it. And so we've been working at practicing these principles. We have tools and resources available on betterarguments.org for faith-based organizations, for schools, for businesses, for community leaders. And we are working to improve polarization, to disrupt polarization, improve our democracy and have more productive employees in our businesses through these principles.
Hey, Amanda, can I just jump in? First of all, I'm so honored to be joining Stacy and Kristen, because they're so great. I just wanted to add pick up on one thing Stacy mentioned about this taking winning off the table. Because I've really tried to internalize this, and I've talked about this with a number of people. And one of the ways I've kind of thought about it and talked with folks is think about almost any kind of difficult issue. It could be who you voted for president. It could be on any of the issues climate change or voting rights. Just pick a difficult issue. If you sit down with somebody and kind of debate that, and somebody's going to talk you out of it, what do you think the odds are that when you're done with that conversation, you're going to change your mind? For most people, the answer to that is pretty slim. Who's going to talk you into, oh, you mean I shouldn't have voted for the person I wanted? I was going to vote for that. The odds of that are pretty slim. So if you take not just winning, but if you take, the concept of conversion off the table, in other words, I'm not going to convert this person into thinking the way okay, then, all right, well, if I'm going to spend 15 or 30 minutes or whatever it is having this conversation, then maybe the smartest thing I can do is at least try to learn from it, right? It's a completely counterproductive conversation just to try to convert them, because the likelihood is no greater than they're going to convert me, which is probably pretty slim. So take advantage of that to kind of learn. Try to figure out, well, why in God's name are so many people with a point of view that's different than mine? It's such a great learning opportunity, particularly because we don't have those conversations enough with people who think differently. So when you have those moments, which are not that often, man, take advantage of it. And I've tried to live by it. I think the hard part of that, as much as anything, is to be able to sit down with folks with very different views and have that conversation. But to me, the key thing is that the taking the winning off the table and trying to learn from the conversation is so critical.
As Stacy said, though, that is the hardest one, because culturally we are wired for advocacy, right? A lot of us who do bridge building work in the US talk in terms of norms, that we're really engaged in this massive norm shifting exercise. Where, many of us in our lives, in our work, have embraced and tried to exhibit advocacy and signaling righteousness and virtuosity and what we believe. And social media amplifies this, of course, a ready platform for us to virtue signal those beliefs and what we advocate for. We're all kind of programmed and wired to do this from a pretty early age in American society in particular. And I know it varies from culture to culture, but this is a real challenge, I think, here in the US, to maybe not reject those norms out of hand, but to add to the mix these new norms, or to strengthen norms of listening and an intellectual curiosity, a desire to learn, especially from people whose views are so vastly different from our own. That takes some work. I know it has for me. Stacy referred back to 2016. Well, after 2016, I kind of pivoted into the work of democracy reform, and very much in a resistance frame. It was a journey for me to move to openness and inquiry. But what happened was my curiosity got the best of me. I just really needed to understand. And if we can get there to a place of intellectual curiosity, or just a fervent desire to learn and understand what makes other people tick, puts us in a really good place. And there are tools out there that can help any of us as individuals. And it has to start there, because for any of us to be proponents of civil discourse or bridge building conversations in our workplaces, we have to individually go on that journey. Stacy's gone on that journey. Bob has gone on that journey. It isn't easy, and it takes some time, but there are tools and resources. We can get into that later in this discussion that can accelerate that journey for you and just kind of crack you wide open to the ability to advance learning and inquiry over advocacy and virtue signaling. They all have a role, but I think we need the whole mix of norms going forward. Stacy, you're nodding, so
no, I absolutely agree. And people need a process. Worked through. We used better arguments as we were getting deeper into our diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation. And one of the officers in our small group said that it was so helpful for her to kind of practice this conversation at work, because for years now, they were in her family with different political views, just deciding we're not going to talk about these issues. In order to keep the peace, we're not going to talk about it. Well, guess what? If we can't even engage in these conversations with our family members that have opposing point of views, like talk about the fragility of democracy, we're not going to be able to do that well with strangers. So I'm so glad, Kristen, that you mentioned the tools and resources, because part of what we're trying to do is give people a frame to disarm some of the negativity and the difficult part of the conversation, and really be able to, as Bob said, go in with a learning mind, be, as you said, Kristen, intellectually curious, and just be more open, be able to be more open, even in these tough conversations.
Many of the practices that we've been talking about are difficult to begin with, but let's think for a moment about the circumstances of a global pandemic weighing on these already difficult conversations. How have you changed your approach, thought differently about your approach, changed your resources and the way that you distribute those resources as a result of the global pandemic? And Stacey, we can start with you.
Sure, it's really interesting for us because we had done 2 years of learning and research to develop the dimensions and principles. And we were about to go out and soft launch into community, just because all of our work to that point was in deep dive conversations in communities with large group, hundreds of people. And then the pandemic came and we couldn't meet. It actually turned out to be a benefit because we could reach more people virtually. We initially partnered with Civic Dinners, which is now inclusive, and so that they already had a process. So we used our facilitation tools and our education about our better arguments principles and used their platform. Again, it's called Inclusive. It was called Civic Dinners. And they have a platform where you can host. They can guide you through hosting a conversation with 8 or 10 people. You can join a conversation, so you can put in your zip code and put the topics that you're interested in. For people that struggle to find people to have these conversations with that may have different points of view, that's a way to do it. You can just sign up and decide you're going to be brave and be a part of a conversation with people on a topic of interest, and engage in that way, properly facilitated and with the proper tools. But Amanda, it really, in a way, helped us, even though it was difficult because people couldn't be together. It forced us to think about virtual gathering faster than we may otherwise have done with the project.
Yeah, I would add to that a couple of things. The research that we did in the Dialogue Project showed that the impact of the pandemic, by and large, made difficult conversations even more difficult. It was really problematic because even the pandemic, as you all know, became political, whether it's masks, vaccines, and so forth, or just concepts around public health. I would say the impact of the pandemic on these kinds of discussions, there, maybe picking up a little bit of what Stacey was saying, there was some good and there was some bad. The good, as Stacey said, was reach, and we probably have all experienced that. I mean, the ability to, kind of live on Zoom maybe has some downsides, but the upside is everybody's kind of become, that's the way of the world, sorts. And that instantly makes people geographically available who otherwise wouldn't have been available. So the ability to engage with a lot of people who otherwise may not have been accessible, I think has been a big positive. I think the other impact, certainly in the business community around the pandemic, has been an increased prioritization around empathy and respect, based on not only the pandemic, but a lot of the social issues that have transpired in the last 18 months. So I guess, that's kind of the good. The bad though is we've all, read a lot and have experienced a lot around mental health issues as a consequence of the pandemic. And I think that has made this that much more difficult. And I think as a consequence of the pandemic, we've all felt a lot more isolated. And so, when you're isolated, it's, we almost have kind of two opposing concepts here. It's like, how do we kind of engage more and get to know each other more and yada, yada, yada. But at the same time, we're isolated. Zoom is good, but we all have a little bit of Zoom fatigue. And I mean, it's a balancing act. There's no easy answer to it, but probably like we found in most aspects of business, the pandemic has just been horrible, full stop, period, right? But in living through it, I mean, there have been some things that have worked out better than I think most of us probably thought, but there are some challenges as well. Bottom line, I think we'll all be a lot better off, when we can kind of get back to whatever the new normal becomes.
Amanda, I'd like to respond to that in a way that touches on how the pandemic has changed practices around bridge building in the country, but maybe starts to point towards tools and resources. Our work is engaged across broadly, hundreds of organizations that are really out there in a valiant way, trying to address the frayed fabric of our country, the ruptures as they exist in our country. And of course, the pandemic took everyone's work, to the extent that they were performing it in a physical, in-person medium, took it virtual. And we talk about the work, the bridge building work broadly in terms of 4 categories. We call them the 4 E's: expose, engage, educate, and elevate. And what I mean by that is that whether it's for you as individuals or for the workplaces in which you're engaged, there are a multitude of resources that, some of which can be delivered in a physical context, but almost all of which translate to the virtual context as well. And by expose, we mean opportunities to expose yourself to a multitude of perspectives and a diversity of information sources. We call it diversifying your information diet. Engage is programs like Better Arguments, these cultivated, curated opportunities to have constructive engagement across difference with some guardrails around it. Educate is the work we can do individually. It doesn't even require another person sitting across from us, but how can we more deeply understand these forces of division and then just some of the aspects of our human nature that make us inherently tribal, that make us inclined to divide, to other, to seek validation and belonging from an in-group and to ostracize an out-group. There's so much opportunity online as well as out in the physical world to educate ourselves more deeply about these themes and trends. The 4th one, which is elevate, is kind of the toughest to achieve in the virtual medium. It's about really, again, appealing to our best selves, our better angels, and reinforcing our cross-cutting identities as people that are outside of our partisan identities. One of the things I see as one of the real negatives of the pandemic is how it accelerated a trend that was already happening, which is the erosion of our engagement in the physical world, in institutions, organizations, communities that help validate different parts of ourselves and also bring us into more direct contact with a diversity of perspectives. And so looking for ways to restore these cross-cutting identities as we get back out into the physical world, as we emerge from the pandemic, I think that's a really important thing for our healing. And I do believe that workplaces are going to be right back at the center of this. Certainly not trying to define or hasten any timeframes for bringing people back to the office. I'm simply saying that as that starts to happen, I think that will have a moderating, healthy, and constructive impact on that sense of isolation, on the mental health issues, and the tendency we may have to go tribal in some of these online environments for the lack of having the healthy social and work-based interactions that our workplaces afford.
Kristen, it's so interesting that you say that, because even as businesses are working towards how they're going to work in the future, and when we go back, where I think many of us are realizing there'll still be some sort of hybrid environment. How do you build culture in that way? So we're spending a ton of time on strengthening weak ties, how we call it. So when you were in an office before, you would see people from all walks of life that weren't on your team. You'd be seeing them in the line to get coffee or seeing them in the cafeteria, and then you may go back to your team. Now those kind of spontaneous interactions aren't as often. So how do we cultivate them today? And how do you make sure that those ties that you have with people that you don't typically interact with on a day-to-day basis, we still are creating opportunities to do that? And we're working on some ideas for that now, because it's so important that we don't become tribal, whether it's in your teams or within your companies, that you've got to really work hard at working across differences, working across departments, just truly trying to work with people that are different than you are.
We did have a few questions come in that hit on that element of how can I be better at working across difference and with people who think differently than I do. If it's okay for me to pose that for you all. The question is about becoming a better listener, especially if the message is delivered by someone who knows better rather than someone who is equally curious. What are some best ways to be a better listener and not get so defensive in those circumstances?
Maybe I'll start with just a source of inspiration that's out there from that has been very helpful for me. And that's the dialogue project that Bob spearheaded, because it's a compilation of inspirational stories about how companies and business leaders are trying to generate those kinds of cultures that you just described, Amanda, those listening cultures that invite curiosity and aim to instill the kinds of practices and behaviors to be modeled within the workplace that drive better conversations, better arguments, if you will, between employees and also between companies and their communities. So I would really love to kind of steer the audience towards just absorbing that content for a whole set of inspirational examples of how the question you posed is being addressed. And I bet Stacy could probably take that more direct and personal in terms of how they're doing it at Allstate.
Yeah, first, I love the question because it starts with intention. It really starts with, I am going to work to be a better listener and truly understand other people's point of view. I can share a story on the winning off the table. We did a whole series for a week at Allstate where people could talk about one of the principles and what it means for them. And the president of our organization talked about, as competitive as he is, that taking winning off the table is the most important principle for him, because if he does not think about how he's getting multiple perspectives, you lose the opportunity to come up with the best solutions. So sometimes the listening, you also think about the intention of being open and listening, but also what you may miss if you are just thinking about how you want to respond. You may miss an idea that's going to be helpful for you as you move forward, or for the organization as you move forward. And I'd also just go back to prioritizing the relationships. Oftentimes we can listen better if we are truly thinking about the relationship we're trying to build. You're less likely to want to talk over someone or just listen to respond if you are really prioritizing the relationship and keeping that center. And then again, I would encourage all of us to work to decenter ourselves. I mean, Kristen said that beautifully, like we're wired to advocate and we have deep beliefs in our points of view. But what we're trying to do through these principles is to decenter you in the conversation, really focus on the outcomes that you want in the relationship and to learn about the issue.
Amanda, what I would add is, I think I kind of hinted at this earlier. One of the challenges is to find the opportunities to listen. It's not easy. And I think in a one-on-one situation, it's also potentially awkward. In other words, if you intentionally want to go out and find somebody who has a different perspective than you on a range of issues and you want to sit down and have that conversation, God bless you can do it, but it's a kind of an awkward, uncomfortable thing for a lot of people. And they might not even know the person well enough to kind of facilitate that. One of the things I think, to admire is if you think about whether it's Kristen's leadership at Civic Health or Stacy, reading an article, and the next thing you know, Allstate's involved with a Better Arguments project, is individuals, including the people who are, participating in the conference today, can make a huge difference. It shouldn't be just about thinking of, the business as an institution. There's a lot that we can do individually that may even also help facilitate this. I'll give you kind of a funny, you can tell me it's a funny example, but it kind of sets up the distinction between kind of individual and institution, and as an organization where faith plays such a role at Notre Dame. Hopefully you can appreciate this. The Jewish holidays were last week, and every year I have a lot of people together, and the last year or two we've done it on Zoom, right? And I always kind of ask somebody to come and speak to the group. And so this year had a remarkable guy. His name is Abdullah Intepli. He's the former chaplain at Duke University, and he teaches at Duke in the Divinity School as well as in the School of Public Policy. And he's one of the leading academic thinkers from the Muslim community. And he was talking about anti-Semitism through the lens of the relationship between the Muslim and Jewish communities. The guy was amazing. And everybody, found it inspiring and interesting and wants more. The opportunity, it could have had somebody just talk about, the same stuff that would have validated everybody's point of view on who cares? I mean, it's just kind of boring, right? But there was an opportunity there to invite somebody to talk in a situation that made it a little bit easier to make the ask. And what I mean by that is, if it was just a one-on-one, it would have been kind of awkward. But because there was a situation that presented itself to say, would you like to talk to this group? It made it easier to make that happen. I mean, I leveraged, obviously, kind of my work at Duke to find Abdullah. And all I'm really doing now is trying to encourage people, think about your own networks, your own connections and so forth. Maybe there are groups you're involved in. Maybe there are holidays. Maybe there are just, things that happen over the course of a year where maybe it'll be interesting to actually invite 6 of your friends to sit around, or 20, whatever, for drinks or lunch or whatever, and invite somebody to kind of stimulate a conversation on a subject that you otherwise might not hear about. My only point is, I think it takes some creativity, a little bit of effort, but individuals can have a big impact. It's not just waiting for the corporation to do something.
I really want to echo that. I mean, just a few years ago, I was working at Intel. I've worked in the corporate sector almost my whole life. Went to business school. I teach at the Stanford Business School, and most of my life I was just working as a tech business leader. And I just want to validate for any of you who have an inkling or a sense that you are someone who has values and strongly held points of view, hard earned, and yet you also feel a sense of concern or anxiety about the state of division in our country and where this is taking us. You are not alone. When I left Intel in 2018, a couple really interesting things happened. First of all, when I left Intel, I decided I was going to be very public about the fact that I was leaving the company because I wanted to go work on the concerns that I had about the health of our democracy and civil discourse in the country. And by virtue of sharing that, I can't tell you how many coworkers just reached out and wanted to have a conversation. It was almost like holding office hours for the last month that I was there at the company with people who were feeling these concerns and anxieties, just kind of bottled up, but didn't know what to do with it. What was even more gratifying then was coming out into the landscape of individuals and organizations that are trying to work on this brokenness, this division in our country, and the fears and anxieties that are fueling that. And trust me, the people who are doing bridge building work in the country aren't sellouts, aren't, both sidesers, aren't people who think that it isn't worth believing in anything. On the contrary, those beliefs, the passion for our country, the passion for specific issues that any of us might carry on our back is precisely what fuels people's decisions to become bridgers. The fact that we can't get to that brighter tomorrow if we're so broken, if we're so divided that we cannot reconcile and we cannot come together to work on some of the big problems that we have right now and we will have in the near future. So really just want to validate a couple of points. If you feel that way, you're not alone. And as an individual, you can have a huge difference. And I will tell you that office hours part of my work is as strong today as it ever was. Every single day, people who just want to understand more about what it means to be a bridger or to be a bridging person in their family, in their friend circles, in their workplace, in their faith community. There's a hunger for this. And fortunately, a whole wealth of organizations and resources for those who want to feed that hunger.
Yeah, that story and Bob's, this may be a very extreme example and not necessarily aligned with the Better Argus principles, which is not about resolution. It really is about listening and learning. But you all have heard the story of Derek Black and the book about his story, Rising Out of Hatred. And he was very deep and being primed as a leader in the white nationalist movement. And he went to college, and a group of students hosting Shabbat dinner invited him to the dinner. And through a series of conversations, one-on-one, a young lady truly trying to understand, like, where do you get these deep, seated beliefs? Anyway, you can read the book for the whole story, but through those conversations, he removed himself from that history and kind of broke from his family, and is now trying to help others, understand how deeply hurtful those point of views can be. So I just mentioned that Bob's conversation sparked that for me, that it is very much can start as an individual, simply reaching out. And you sometimes can be surprised by reaching out to seek to understand the power that can have on an individual, and then therefore broader communities.
I'll share two other quick examples, two people I draw inspiration from day in and day out. And you may have heard of both of these folks. Daryl Davis, a Black man who has done unbelievable work cultivating connection into people who have been members of the KKK, of the modern day KKK. And through his willingness to engage, to pursue curiosity, and for him, it was a single question, like, how can you hate me if you don't even know me? And it was that curiosity to know the answer to that question that brought him into the heart of a movement that's antithetical to who he is and his very existence. And through that, he too has managed to extricate a significant number of people from the membership of that organization. And so Daryl's story is extremely inspirational. Another is a woman named Susan Bro, and she is the mother of Heather Heyer, the counter-protester who was killed when she was run down by a car in Charlottesville in 2017. And Susan Bro is well known in the bridging community as someone who is sad, but not angry and bitter, and has really channeled her grief into bridge building work to address racial division and other forms of division in our country. And so I tell you, individuals can have outsized impact, and those are two people whose courage and bridging propensity I draw from every day.
We have a few questions here that connect to this idea of bridging and being a bridging person. And thank you for sharing those remarkable examples for us. What advice can you offer if you are a bridging person who is faced with a non-bridger? And how do you move past that in order to have a productive conversation? And in particular, what can businesses do about that?
Well, I will start and be honest. Like, we, in the Better Arguments framework, one of the first things that we say, if you go to the website, that everyone involved needs to live into the principles and want to listen. And there's some topics, and there may be some people that the framework is not meant for. So I'll just state that up front from our perspective, that you have to have willing participants across the board. Otherwise, one person can't be engaged in a better argument with these principles, and the other person trying to debate or convert. It's not going to be fruitful.
What I tend to encounter most, and I assure you, it comes from both right-leaning and left-leaning perspectives in our country, and even that's an oversimplification to say right and left. There's such a diversity of positions on our political and ideological spectrum these days. But what I tend to encounter most is just either a resistance to the very idea of bridging and connecting across difference that may be grounded in fear or uncertainty, but also, frankly, some exhaustion and burnout with those who have tried and it just hasn't gone well. It isn't easy. There are, again, really valid, deep-seated reasons why someone is not wired with a propensity to invite connection, inquiry across deep division. But I often come back to a pretty simple question, which is, what's the alternative? If we don't do this, what's the alternative? Where is this all heading? And I'm frequently kind of shocked and dismayed with the answers I get back. It's amazing what people carry around with them deep in their heart, but not wear on their sleeve. And it could be anything from just an optimistic sense that this is just a phase. We're just going through a phase as a country and things will get better. And I really hope that that is true. Believe me, I really hope that that's a true perspective. To another, not uncommon point of view, which is, well, I think we're headed for more serious breakdown. I think we're headed for acute conflict. Some people will say civil war. And I'm amazed that people carry these fears and concerns around with them, sometimes in an almost fatalistic way, like this is going to happen. It's just going to happen. And I don't accept that. What really drives and fuels me every day in the bridging work is also fear that our country will go in that direction. And I fervently don't want to see that happen, even if there's just the remotest, most infinitesimal chance that it all falls apart. I want to do whatever I can every day to see that that's not the outcome. So I start with that question. What's the alternative? What's the alternative to listening, inquiring, and trying to engage?
Amanda, if I go to your question, it kind of highlights the difficulty of the conversation. And to bring us back to business, that's why there's such an opportunity and need for business to do more. These conversations are often better realized when there's some degree of facilitation. And business can help make that happen in kind of a neutral, productive way. And, for those of us who are listening to this session today, who are in business, there are these kind of twin trends happening that are supporting business to do more. I mean, on the business, one trend is, I'll call it stakeholder capitalism, and the other trend is employee activism, right? So the stakeholder capitalism goes back to, I don't know, Larry Fink's letter about the role of, around investing in companies that are kind of giving back to society. The Business Roundtable statement around it's about stakeholders, not just shareholders. Every company on the planet these days is talking more and more about, being purpose-driven. ESG is percolated up to be kind of one of the major drivers in business today. So there are all these, if you listen to Alan Murray, he's preaching the gospel of stakeholder capitalism, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. It's just constant, right? So that's, I think, in some respects, creating a very positive, comfortable, mainstream environment for CEOs and other business leaders to recognize they need to do more. And what was acceptable 10 years ago, not only acceptable, frankly, what was preferable 10 years ago, which was to avoid anything that had the sense of, controversy or politics to it, to avoid it. Now, that's not really where the world is. And that's being fueled by that second thing, which is employee activism. Most of the reasons companies are being pushed to take stands on a range of issues is, their employees want to know, well, where the hell do you stand on climate change? Where do you stand on this? Where do you stand on that? And it's not that companies need to speak out on every issue. And one of the things that we're kind of working on right now in the Dialogue Project is helping business leaders understand maybe what some of the frameworks are to kind of do that calculus. What issues do we have a stake in, and where does it make sense for us to talk? Where can we make a meaningful contribution? And frankly, where should we shut up? It's none of our business, right? But these things are all happening out there, and business leaders need to deeply engage and no longer kind of hide from it. And we're seeing this more and more. And just to kind of bring it full circle, I think what the population needs is for those business leaders to do more to help facilitate this, because some of the very work being done inside companies has tremendous benefit outside the four walls, or the four virtual walls, of the corporation. And that's why we really need business leaders to step up and do more, because if they don't, it's kind of like, given the findings of the trust barometer and so forth, if business leaders don't step up, who will?
Yeah, I teach at Stanford's Business School and see the administration and faculty really grappling with all of these questions, looking at an initiative around how to address some of these societal dimensions of employee activism and stakeholder capitalism. I myself am going to be co-teaching a course there for the first time this fall that is called Big Arguments, Courageous Leadership. And so that's just a data point to show that business schools, Notre Dame and Duke and Columbia and Harvard and Stanford and many business training institutions across the country are asking the questions that we're posing on this panel today. So the hope is that out of all of this ferment will come a more institutionalized approach to raising up a generation of business leaders that bring the curiosity, the intellectual humility, the open-mindedness, the welcoming of diverse perspectives, whether that's driven more by a sense of risk or a sense of opportunity. Hey, it almost doesn't matter. Let's do this because we have to, and let's leverage companies and workplaces as institutions that foster and encourage these norms.
Thank you all for offering such valuable insights and practical tips for us today. We are coming close to the end of our time together, and I'd just like to take a moment for our participants to have a chance to summarize or do some final self-reflection on some of the topics that we've talked about today. In particular, we started out by talking about using the workplace as a way to create some time and some space. And Bob, you used the term laboratory for this type of conversation, and rather than only thinking of it as a safe zone. We also talked about the role of the individual and all having a part to play, and certainly business leaders, future business leaders are an important part of our stakeholder group for today. Are there other key takeaways that you would all like to share before we close our session today?
Well, I'll kind of share one or two things I think at least worth thinking about. Again, the extent to which I think, this audience includes a lot of presumably business students as well as business executives. Two thoughts. One is consider in a lot of the training that a lot of companies are doing, expanding kind of the lens. It's not so much expanding the work necessarily, but a lot of companies in the last year or two have started doing more training around things like unconscious bias training, just as an example, right? It's more often than not done with an eye towards productivity in the workplace and working with your peers, colleagues, maybe customers and so forth. That kind of training has enormous value on the weekends as well as the weekdays. And just, I think, kind of understanding that, and maybe, I don't know, if you're going to devote 10 hours of that training, maybe devote 1 or 2 of it to, okay, how do we apply this in the outside world? That's low-hanging fruit, easy to do. I think it'd have a big impact. The second thing is, General Mills has a great program. Others have something similar, but General Mills has a great program called Courageous Conversations. You can read about it on the Dialogue Project website, which is dialogueproject.study. But basically, I won't spend a lot of time with it now, but they bring together purely on a voluntary basis as many of their employees as they want. Obviously, it's done virtually now, every couple of months, and just discuss really, really difficult issues. They have a guest come in and talk, and then they break up into small breakout groups of no more than 10. They have people who are trained in facilitation, and over the course of 2 hours, every couple of months, they have all of their people have a chance just to listen and learn and be exposed, and it goes really well. And this is the kind of thing that I think 5 years ago probably would have been perceived as kryptonite, like, this is not what you do in the workplace. And they're finding it to be not only effective, but it kind of starts to reinforce the values of the company and what they stand for. So I just encourage business leaders who are kind of listening to think about, what's a variation of that is appropriate from a values and culture perspective to your own organization. Think about what works for you. It doesn't have to be that. It can be anything. But anything that moves the ball forward would be really, really helpful.
I dropped
Thank
my
you.
sorry.
Ahead,
I dropped my suggestion in the chat, but just a shout out to a couple of other organizations offering services and frameworks for this. 2 companies specifically, Open Mind Platform and also Business for America. These are a couple of great resources you could delve into.
And we're also able to post some resources and follow-up reads on the ThinkND website. That would be an excellent repository for the great ideas and suggestions today. Stacy, Kristen, Bob, thank you for your time. A special thank you to our participants. I hope that you will all join us again in 2 weeks. We will have Dr. Elizabeth Lapari from Denison University speaking to us on the freedom to listen. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.